An ordinary morning at the bank turns into a chain of events when one client faces an unexpected rejection. What begins as a routine operation quickly reveals a deeply ingrained system of bias. No one at the bank has any idea who the person standing on the other side of the counter really is. And when the truth comes out, everything changes forever. The morning in downtown Chicago began routinely and evenly. A piercing autumn wind walked along the glass facades of skyscrapers, twisting street newspapers into spirals and lifting fragile golden leaves into the air. Cars rushed by with a characteristic roar, street cafes opened, and hundreds of people flocked to the business district, hurrying to work, to offices, to banks. On the corner of the street stood a white glass and concrete building, a branch of Horizon First Bank. One of the best banks in the city, a model of elegant corporate perfection. The morning sun slid across its transparent walls, reflecting off the immaculately clean floor, and every element, from the polite clerks to the austere jelly chairs in the waiting area, projected order and luxury. At 9 a.m., the bank doors slid silently open, letting in a short man in a light blue shirt and beige trousers. His steps were measured, his gaze observant, and his movements confident. No one paid attention to him. He didn't look like an important person, didn't wear a haute couture suit, and didn't have security with him. This was the intention. Matthew Coleridge walked into the building as if he were one of many. He didn't want to be recognized. He didn't want to be smiled at with false politeness just because his name was CEO on his business card. He wasn't here today as the head of Horizon First, but as a regular customer looking to withdraw $15,000 from his personal account. He glanced around the spacious lobby. Everything was in its place. People in business suits, customers queuing, bank employees moving with rehearsed precision. The air was filled with the faint scent of coffee, polished wood, and, as always, the subtle tension of a professional environment. A man of about 50 in a dark gray jacket stood near one of the counters. He was being served by a smiling blonde whose name could be read from her badge, Kara Mason. She was talking animatedly to the client, counting the bills. Matthew couldn't help but notice, $20,000 handed over without asking any questions. The client thanked him, put the money away, and headed for the exit without experiencing a drop of suspicion or scrutiny. Matthew pressed his lips together. He already knew how everything would go. Or not go. The line moved quickly. A few minutes later, he found himself opposite that same Kara. There was no warmth or interest in her gaze. He could have been anyone or no one, it didn't matter to her. "Fill this out," she said, handing him a plastic board with a cash withdrawal form. Her voice was cold, mechanical. No greeting. No smile. Matthew silently took a pen from his breast pocket and quickly filled out the form. He was precise in his actions, not only out of habit but also because he knew that here, now, the slightest mistake could become a reason. He placed the completed form and his driver's license on the counter. Kara didn't even glance at the ID. Her gaze fell on the number under the amount column, $15,000. "We cannot process this request," she said, handing him the form back. "Excuse me." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "We don't perform such operations," she repeated with a hint of irritation. "I just watched the man in front of me withdraw $20,000. You didn't ask him a single question." Kara crossed her arms over her chest, looking at him with a hint of superiority. "That's different." Matthew straightened up slowly. "With what?" Kara turned away, her eyes flickering toward the glass room at the back. A woman in a formal navy suit stood inside, Joan Drake, the department manager. She was watching the situation, arms crossed. Their eyes met. Matthew saw a small nod, almost imperceptible. Kara straightened up. "We cannot issue such funds without additional verification," she said with greater confidence. "I provided the ID, you see my account. What's the problem?" His voice remained calm, but tension was building beneath the surface. Kara smiled with unnatural politeness. "It's suspicious. Such large sums of cash are cause for concern." "Suspicious." Matthew repeated the word, as if tasting it. He felt it sink into his chest. A heavy, unpleasant weight. He knew what Kara really meant. Not suspicious, but unacceptable. For him. For the way he looked. "I wonder," he said slowly. "That's not a term you used for the man who walked away with more than I did." Kara looked away. "I don't make rules. But you know how to choose when and to whom to apply them." Irritation flashed in her eyes. "I need to call the manager," she said sharply and headed towards the office. Matthew remained where he was, his hands on the counter. He felt the air around him begin to thicken. The people behind him began to quiet down. Some of the employees at the other windows were no longer so enthusiastic about serving customers. Their gazes slid towards what was happening. He caught the eye of an elderly woman standing nearby. She smiled for a moment, awkwardly, like someone who wants to express sympathy but doesn't dare intervene. He didn't answer, not because he was angry, but because he knew that in situations like these, words of sympathy meant nothing unless they were followed by action. A minute later, the doors opened. Joan Drake walked out of the office, her expression honed by years of negotiations and official explanations. Kara walked behind her, her chin slightly raised. "Good morning." Joan began with the forced politeness she used for problem clients. "I realize we've had a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," Matthew said calmly. "I want to withdraw my money. We have certain security protocols," she continued, as if she hadn't heard him. "Such amounts require additional verification." "Interesting. Just now, 20,000 was given out to me without any verification. Is it somehow connected with my face?" Joan frowned slightly. "I need to confirm the source of your funds." "You're holding my bill in your hands," he said. "Check it." Joan pursed her lips slightly. "I will ask you to cooperate." "I cooperate. You are the one looking for reasons to refuse me." He spoke evenly, without aggression. But there was something in his voice that made people tense up. It was then that Joan made a small gesture with her hand. At the entrance to the bank, a security guard stood up tall, broad-shouldered, with a blank expression on his face. He headed towards the counter. Matthew didn't move. He knew what would happen next. And this time he decided that leaving was not an option. The marble floor sent a chill up his spine, but Matthew stood still. He knew that moving would only increase the tension. Public spaces, especially ones like banks, were like stages. Everyone had a role, even if they didn't know it. Someone was the observer, someone the performer, someone the judge. Many were looking at him now. Not directly, no, with slithering glances, hidden behind phone screens, behind black and white business newspapers, behind polite, false smiles. A security guard approached him, a tall white man with a short haircut and a stocky build. His badge said, "Stephen Rose Security." His footsteps echoed dully on the flagstones of the floor. No doubt in his face, no question in his eyes. Just duty, habitual, mechanical. Matthew knew men like that. He'd met them in many places. College admissions offices, hotels, airports, conference rooms. Men who didn't ask questions if the woman on the other end of the line was in a suit, with a complete sense of impunity. Stephen stopped a couple of steps away from him. "I'll ask you to come with me," he said without looking into her eyes. Matthew turned his head towards Joan. She was standing half-turned, her arms folded, her chin slightly raised. She was already looking at the next client. "It's as if everything is already over." "On what grounds?" Matthew asked, keeping his voice low. "We have the right to terminate service if the client does not cooperate with the bank," Stephen responded, repeating someone else's words as if they were a memorized text. "I've given you everything you asked for, and yet I'm still being pushed out." Matthew looked back at the guard. "Are you sure you want to be a part of this?" Stephen didn't answer. He just stepped closer. "Please leave." There was silence in the room. Not deathly, but very cautious. People stopped pressing the ATM buttons. A feeling of awkwardness hung in the air. Matthew slowly pulled his phone out of his pocket. He picked it up, unlocked it, and pressed record. "I'm filming this as evidence. I'm a client of Horizon First Bank. I have my documents with me. I haven't broken any rules. And I'm being asked to leave." He panned the camera to Stephen, then to Joan and Kara, who had returned to her position behind the counter, clearly trying to look unconcerned. "Why are you refusing to serve me?" he asked. "I'm not authorized to answer such questions," Stephen said curtly. "Of course, I'm not authorized," Matthew said with a bitter smile. "But I'm very well trained to stand between convenience and truth." He didn't resist when Stephen placed his hand on his elbow. The grip was firm, confident, not rough, but with a clear message: "You are not the boss here." At that moment, something moved near the glass doors. "Coleridge," a hoarse voice said. Stephen turned. Another guard was approaching them, an African-American man in his mid-30s. He moved slowly, almost hesitantly. His badge was tilted, but his name was still legible: Jared Holloway. Matthew noticed right away, his eyes were different. Not like Stephen's, there was no icy emptiness in them. There was knowledge. Is everything okay? Jared asked. Everything is under control, Stephen muttered without turning around. But Jared didn't leave. He stopped next to him. Matthew felt his gaze on the side, not questioning but sympathetic. You shouldn't do this, he said quietly to Stephen. We both know. Stephen tensed. I'm doing my job. You can't always follow orders if they stink, Jared snapped. But it was already too late. Matthew felt himself being led toward the exit as if he were an intruder, a criminal, a threat. He felt the customer's eyes burning into his back. Some were probably sympathetic. Some were probably happy. Most were pretending nothing was happening. On the way out, Stephen abruptly threw open the doors. Here's your exit. Matthew took a step into the cold. And before the door slammed behind him, something hit the asphalt next to his foot. His ID card. He looked down at the plastic card, glinting in the morning light. Symbol. Metaphor. Everything that confirms that he is who he is thrown to the ground. Jared was there again. He leaned over silently, picked up the ID, carefully wiped the corner with his sleeve, and handed it over. Here. This happens here. Often. Matthew took the card, their fingers touching briefly. Thank you. You're welcome, Jared said quietly. It's just, if there's a way to change this, do it. Because we can't. We're down. No one believes us. He fell silent. Then, after a pause, he added, I'm glad you didn't keep quiet. Matthew nodded. Not today. He took out his phone. Again. But not for the record. For a call. The fingers quickly dialed the number. A second ring was not required. Brandon, he said into the phone. Urgent. Headquarters. And bring everything you need with you. On the other end was a short answer. I'm on my way already. Matthew disconnected the call. He didn't know if anyone inside could hear him. But deep down he was sure this wouldn't be the end of the story. This would be its turning point. He turned slowly and looked at the glass front of the bank. The sun was just beginning to break through the gray clouds. The wind in the narrow streets of Chicago had grown colder. It whipped Matthew's face, ruffling the collar of his shirt as if to wipe away the last of his humiliation. He stood on the sidewalk in front of Horizon First Bank, the bank he had founded, built from scratch, and built into one of the largest private financial institutions in the country. And yet today, right now, he stood on the street like an outsider. Like a man who had been denied the right to be heard. His phone vibrated in his pants pocket. He didn't take it out. He knew who was coming. Brandon Ellison, his second-in-command, his partner, his friend. All he had to do was wait. In the glass walls of the bank, he saw a reflection of himself, not in a business suit, not in the presidential office, not surrounded by the board of directors. In a regular shirt with an upright posture and a reserved face, he looked like the employees saw him on camera footage. And in this reflection, there was truth. Behind the glass, life went on as if nothing had happened. Kara was back at the counter, Joan was hurrying somewhere with a tablet in her hands. Security guard Stephen stood at the door, looking over the heads of everyone like a sentry at an empty fort. Matthew stepped to the side and leaned against the wall. They think you left. The voice next to him was quiet but clear. He turned around. Jared Holloway stood at the entrance, hands in the pockets of his dark jacket, eyes directed inward. But you didn't leave, he continued, not looking at Matthew. And that already makes you different. Matthew nodded silently. Not many people decide to come back when they are pushed out. Most just move on. Or break down. I'm not one of them. I see that, Jared said. They stood in silence. How long have you been working here? Matthew asked. Almost 6 years. And you've been watching this all this time? Almost every day, Jared chuckled slightly, but there was no humor in his face. Just not always with such an ending. The end hasn't come yet, Matthew said quietly. It was at that moment that a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up to the side of the road. The car braked sharply without signaling. Before the driver could turn off the engine, the door swung open and Brandon Ellison stepped out. Tall, gray-haired, in a coat with straight lapels and a straight, confident stride. He needed no introduction. He was known in banking circles, on Wall Street, on regulatory boards. When he saw Matthew, he didn't say a word. He just nodded briefly. That was enough. Matthew turned and followed him, Jared following a little to the side. The doors swung open as if on command. Brandon was the first one inside. The air in the bank seemed to freeze. The customers turned warily. Kara froze behind the counter, noticing a familiar face. Joan, walking down the hall, stopped when she saw who had entered. She turned pale. Mr. Allison. She began, taking a step forward. I didn't expect. It's obvious, he snapped. He spoke evenly, but there was steel in his voice. Where's he? He asked. Sorry? Brandon raised his hand and pointed at Matthew. There he is. The founder of the bank. The man you just threw out into the street. Silence fell over the room. The hum of the automatic printers, the clicking of keys, the conversations of customers, everything froze. Joan was taken aback, her expression showing an awkward, genuine panic. This must be. Mistake. Brandon took a step closer. You didn't even check his ID. You didn't even look in the system. You just assumed he wasn't who he said he was. Kara Mason, standing a little further away, took a step back, her face frozen in an expression that was at once fear, regret, and habitual self-defense. We are following protocol, she said quickly. Protocol? Brandon turned to her. Please clarify where in the protocol it says that a customer with a clearly completed form, ID, and an active account should be refused service? She remained silent. Silence is also an answer, he added. Stephen Rose watched from behind the glass door. He realized that the scent of power had changed the direction of the wind. But he said nothing. Brandon exhaled, lowering his hands. Matthew, he said, addressing his friend for the first time, what do you want to do? Matthew walked up to the counter. He stood opposite Kara. Count. $15,000. Mine. Kara didn't dare to object or look him in the eye. She lowered her head and, with trembling fingers, began to enter the data. Matthew turned to Brandon. Start by firing Joan and Kara. Now. And request all customer complaint records for the last year. I'm sure this isn't the first time. Brandon nodded. Already started. And one more thing, Matthew turned to Jared, who was standing against the wall, trying not to attract attention. Him. Brandon turned around. What's wrong with him? We're getting up. The head of the internal security service of this branch. From tomorrow. Jared froze. Mr. Coleridge, No need, Matthew interrupted. You've said enough when you've said anything. Brandon chuckled. Sounds like the end of a chapter. Matthew took the printed check and looked at the money neatly folded in front of him. No, Brandon, he said. This is just the beginning. And at Horizon First Bank, before the eyes of dozens of employees and clients, history began to change direction. The air in the Horizon First Bank was tense. No longer corporate fresh with the scent of coffee and air conditioning, but fear. Fear of getting caught. Fear of losing your seat. Fear that used to come only to those who sat on the opposite side of the counter. Now this fear has taken root among the employees. Matthew Coleridge stood at the teller window across from Kara Mason. A stack of cash lay between them, exactly $15,000. His money. The money he'd just been denied access to. Not because he was undocumented. Not because he was blacklisted. But because he didn't look like what the system expected. Kara, looking down, carefully counted the bills, her fingers trembling. It seemed she was trying to dissolve in this task, to turn it into the only thing that her reality now rested on. Matthew kept his eyes on her. Not with anger. With attention. With awareness. He wanted her to feel this moment. To not let it slip by, as such moments often did, blurred, mundane, forgotten. Brandon Ellison stood next to him, his expression businesslike, but those who knew him might have noticed the tightness of his lips. Is everything okay? He asked quietly. Matthew nodded. Yes. I got what I came for. He took the money, carefully folded it into a leather folder and turned to the crowd, which had now stopped hiding. People stood in silence. Some looked away awkwardly, some with regret, some with interest. No one moved. Joan Drake was still standing slightly to the side, as if trying to disappear behind the glass of her invisible authority. Now it was destroyed. Her face showed everything: confusion, anger, resentment, fear. Brandon turned to face her. You're fired, he said without unnecessary ceremony. Effective today. But she tried. This is not up for discussion. You did not check the client's documents. You made a decision based on your personal perception. And you gave the order to remove the bank owner from the premises. The words sounded like hammer blows on glass. This could be seen as discrimination, he added. Or it could be seen as a gross violation of domestic policy. In any case, the result is the same. Joan bit her lip and looked down. She said nothing more. Mr. Coleridge, said guard Stephen Rose. I was just following orders. Matthew looked at him. Yes, that's exactly what you did. But it's precisely these people who become the hands of other people's prejudices. You didn't ask a single question. You didn't doubt. You didn't stop. You did exactly what thousands before you did when they were told, get him out. Stephen nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He understood. You're fired too, Brandon said. Without the possibility of reinstatement. Matthew turned to Jared, who was standing a little to the side. His face was calm, but there was a storm in his eyes. It was as if he couldn't believe this was happening. You knew, Matthew said. From the beginning. I've seen it happen over and over again, Jared said. But I've never been able to change anything. Now you can, Brandon said. Mr. Holloway, beginning tomorrow, you are taking over as the senior manager of internal security for this department. Jared's eyes widened. It was you. Because you were the only person in uniform who decided not to remain silent. And that means more than 20 years of service according to the regulations. Pause. Thank you, sir, was all Jared said. Brandon looked around the room. Every employee who witnessed the incident and failed to intervene will be referred to a mandatory program to address internal biases. Repeated ignoring of such situations will lead to disciplinary consequences. Nobody objected. Matthew looked at his employees, now former and remaining. This system was designed to be fair, he said. But it will never be so long as we remain silent. His voice was not loud, but every phrase sounded clear. I don't want anyone to feel out of place in my bank. I don't want people to be afraid to approach the counter. And I won't tolerate our employees putting their power above human dignity. He looked at Kara. She stood quietly, silently. You need to think, he said, deeply, about who you want to be. And if your choice is to be part of change, not a break on it, then maybe you have a chance. Kara nodded. Without words. He turned to Jared and pulled one of the stacks of cash out of the folder. He held it out. Take a day off. Relax. Think about what you'll do next. Tomorrow will be your first day in your new position. Jared took the money hesitantly, seeming to disbelieve the reality of the moment. Thank you. That's not gratitude, Matthew said. That's a start. He headed for the exit. People made way for him, not out of fear, but out of respect. Or perhaps out of shame. When he had already reached the door, someone whispered from behind. Is this him? That same Coleridge? He stopped and turned around. Yes, he said. And next time, before you judge someone by their appearance, check their name. And with that, he walked out into the morning air, this time not exiled, not humiliated, but the master of his place. With his head held high. And determined to make sure that this never happened again. The morning fog had thickened again outside. Light streaks of steam rose from the asphalt, curling at his feet as if the city itself were exhaling the heavy air of change. Matthew Coleridge stood outside Horizon First Bank, no longer as a humiliated customer, no longer as a silent witness to the decisions of others, but as a man who had reclaimed the space that was rightfully his. Inside the bank, everything was calming down. The employees returned to work, but now every glance, every gesture was quieter, more careful. Something had changed invisibly, as if the glass walls, previously neutral, had become transparent in a different sense. They no longer hid people from each other. Matthew took a few steps down the sidewalk. He felt in his chest not euphoria, not pride, but weariness. The kind that comes after an internal struggle in which you not only won, but also reminded yourself once again how much more there was to come. His phone was vibrating in his pocket. He was in no hurry to take it out. Too many thoughts and not a single one he wanted to say out loud. You didn't just make a scene, a voice said from behind. Matthew turned. Brandon Ellison was walking out of the building, coat flapping in the wind, eyes sparkling with dry, squeezed admiration. You turned the whole system inside out, he added. I just walked into my bank. No tie. No suit. And I wanted to get my money. And for that, you were made out to be a petty crook. Brandon stepped closer, putting his hands in his pockets. Do you have any idea how many times this has happened to others? To those who didn't have the opportunity to call the one on the board of directors? Matthew nodded. I can imagine. That's why I can't remain silent any longer. He pulled out his phone, opened the Notes app. A few lines, just headings. What is it? Brandon asked. Reforms. He turned the screen. There were lines on it. Mandatory racial sensitivity and bias training for all levels of employees, anonymous complaint channels and internal monitoring, internal audit of customer service for the past 2 years, appointment of an independent ethics committee. Brandon whistled. Ambitious. No more than necessary, Matthew replied. Stop pretending equality is a slogan. Across the street. A small figure hid in the shadows. Jared Holloway? He didn't come over. He just stood there as if he didn't know if it was right to be there again. Matthew motioned for him to come over. Come here. Jared approached hesitantly, his gait still carrying something of the guard who was used to being a shadow, always on the edge of attention, never in the center. Tomorrow you're walking into an office you've never been to before. You'll have people reporting to you. Decisions. Responsibility. Are you ready? Jared nodded. I don't know what will be more, fear or the desire to prove that I can. Fear is normal, Matthew said. The key is to not let it speak for you. He took a business card out of his pocket. It had his direct number on it. If you ever feel down, call. Not the manager. Not HR, me. Jared took the business card and squeezed it in his palm. Thank you, sir. Matthew smiled for the first time all day. Just call me Matthew. That evening, sitting in his house, he looked out the window at the city at night. The lines of lights stretched into the distance, the cars crawled along the streets, and a thought was born in his head. How many such branches, how many such Carr, Joan, and Stephen are there throughout the country? How many Matthews with neither a board of directors nor a name on the sign at the entrance? There was a map on the table, a detailed location of all Horizon First branches. He marked the ones where complaints had been recorded. 15. He traced the route with his finger. Tomorrow he would go to one of them. Personally. Unannounced. Unescorted. He didn't want to hunt. He wanted to build a future. But to do this, it was first necessary to clear out the past. The next morning, a headline appeared in the news feed of one of the largest business publications. Horizon First CEO personally intervenes in his bank's racial discrimination scandal. The article included a photograph of Matthew leaving a building holding a leather folder, his face collected but calm. There is a comment under the photo. He didn't come with an entourage. He didn't issue a press release. He just did what he had to do, what anyone in power had to do. And it was true. A week later, a new office opened in the headquarters building, the Office of Equity and Justice, headed by Jared Holloway. His first solution was to introduce an anonymous complaint form available to both employees and customers. His second was to hire an external consultant on racial sensitivity for all managers. And Matthew? He started going around to branches. Without a tie. Without an escort. Just like a client. Because true control is not in supervision, but in participation. And if you want to change the system, start by becoming its mirror yourself. He knew it would be long. And difficult. And would require more than just decisions. But now he will never again stand in line at his own bank and remain silent when he is refused. He will speak. And he will hear those who have always spoken but who have not been listened to for so long. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video so you don't miss new stories.